Hello and welcome to Events Dear Boy, the podcast for anyone involved in business events. If you're a conference producer, corporate event organiser or events agency, then we're here for you. We want to share the highs and the lows, the best practices and the horror stories. You can expect ideas and inspiration and maybe some laughs too.
And if you're a speaker at these events, then we're here for you too. We'll talk about how you do it, what happens when it all goes well or terribly.
My name is Catherine McNamara and I'm the marketing lead at the talent agency Pomona Partners and someone who has organised many business events in my working life. And alongside me is Pomona Partners founder and veteran of 1,000 speaking gigs, Tom Cheesewright.
Each episode, we're going to be joined by a guest from the business events space, either an organiser or a speaker. We'll ask them to share their experiences, both good and bad, for our entertainment, and their tips for other people in their positions. We're now in season 2, so there are plenty of episodes featuring incredible guests for you to go back and listen to or watch if you haven't seen or heard them yet.
And I'm delighted that this week we're joined by Phil Lewis. Phil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So let's start off with a really easy question. What is your area of expertise? What's your background?
I'm going to start right at the beginning and then canter you through in about 30 seconds, a career of about 25 years in length. So I started back in marketing, way back in whenever it was, 1876, it now feels like, and worked in loads of different marketing agencies, owned a couple of them myself, span into management consultancy for a bit, and then had this sort of dawning realization over a period of a few years that I wasn't really interested in solving people's problems. I was interested in why they had them in the first place. And I guess the question that started gnawing away at me over years and years was like, hang on a second, I seem to be surrounded by all these really intelligent, really creative, really high energy people, all of whom get out of bed in the morning to do the best job that they know how to do for their organizations, and yet stick them into a work environment and it feels like all of that talent, energy, ideas, creativity has kind of got nowhere to go, or it feels really limited in terms of its ability to reach its full expression in the organization. And really intelligent people seem to be very capable of therefore making some quite dumb decisions in the collective, right? So I became sort of really interested in the difference between the kind of capability of the human and the capability of the organization. And then, so about sort of 10, 12 years ago, I started off on what we must, for the sake of podcast law, euphemize as the journey, which has basically taken me into running a couple of different businesses, both of which are fundamentally focused on helping human beings get out of their own way at work. So one of them is a corporate change practice. So I and my team, we work with large organizations going through significant transformation that's obviously hit this, that's often hit the skids in some way, shape or form. And what we do with those businesses is we help them get out of their own way and solve the kind of human problems, the problems that are getting in the way of that change. And I also work with, on a one-to-one basis and sometimes one-to-few with boards and leadership teams in sometimes smaller organizations who are wrestling with the same sort of stuff. And usually what you have in organizations is people sort of jumping up and down, leaders jumping up and down, going, I just want. And it's usually to do with the fact they're trying to get somewhere, but something they can't quite see is getting in the way. And so my expertise that's evolved over the last sort of 25 years, and the work I do is all grounded in what's going on underneath the surface here in terms of how people think, how they feel, the culture of the organization, the way that you've got the business set up, all of that kind of stuff, which is ultimately standing in the way of you getting what you want out of your people. And it is a tremendously rich and exciting field of work to be in. It kind of pulls on coaching, it pulls on consulting. To a point, actually, it can pull on things like counseling and psychotherapy principles, if not practice. And it's about really leaning into some of those human challenges we all have at work.
It's a fascinating space, and one that resonates so much with so many of the conversations I hear coming out of organizations where they just don't understand why change isn't working. Yet they feel like they've done everything right from a purely sort of mechanical perspective, but completely missed so much of that. I guess you'd call it almost sort of organisational empathy to understand all of the other factors that go into change.
I could go off here, so I'm not going to. But the key word in what you've just used is mechanical, right? And there is this kind of factory conception of business. And you actually, if you look at language that's often used around business, right, all over the place, what you see is this sort of, it's kind of, I think, a sort of hangover from maybe the both the birth of management consulting, but actually, you know, the sort of mills of the 20th century and the kind of factory view of work in the 20th century, which is basically organization as machine, right? So into the machine, I put a whole load of input, whatever that is, raw materials, human capital, my least favorite phrase of all time. And at the back of the machine, we get a set of outputs. And therefore, if something's going wrong, we have to understand the business as a machine, right? And we have to start looking across how the machine functions as though it's an engineering problem and solve those engineering problems. The issue with that is that businesses are not machines, they're organisms, right? And what I mean by that is ultimately, if you think of the human being, right? The human being, brilliant, imperfect, knows what it needs for its own flourishing, incredibly creative, all of those sorts of things, irrational, difficult to contain and manage, all sorts of emotional hinterland and all of that. It's the human being that's coming into work every day. Right? And it's the sum total of the human beings and the endeavour of the human beings that make up the organisation. So if we start to treat those human beings in all of their emotionality and irrationality and brilliance and everything else and ingenuity as though they were just cogs, we shouldn't be surprised when those cogs kind of go, I'm not really a cog, thanks very much. I don't really like this, and I don't want to be co-opted into that way of thinking and that way of behaving. And if you can start doing work and talking with senior leaders in organizations and getting them to understand that what they're actually dealing with is a human problem, not a machine problem. And I always say to people, you can be efficient with everything but people, right? And if you don't believe me, try and have an efficient row with your significant other, right? It's like if you can start getting them to actually do the real work of like understanding the human dynamics of their organization and what informs those human dynamics and how best to work with those human dynamics, you can unlock change and growth and all the other things you're seeking very, very quickly. But you're not going to do it by continuing to kind of hammer as though what you're trying to do is get a cog back into a machine. It just doesn't work like that.
So listening to that, Phil, I can 100% see how you have become a speaker and why people want to listen to you. But to reframe the question, how on earth did you become how did you take the leap from having this as your the lens that you see things through to being able to take that leap and then go and speak about it? What would that, as part of the journey, look like?
Very organic, which is another word we must use, isn't it? It's all been very organic. So what I mean by that is, if you do the kind of work I do, a lot of my work is conversational, really. So I had this joke for many years that my core skill was being good in meetings. You know, it's like literally, he gives good meeting, you know, so that's what I'm good at, you know. But I sort of stand by it in a way, because I'm like actually, if you just come out the Euros, haven't we? The meeting's my kind of football ground in that sense. That's kind of my sporting arena, or whatever you want to call it. And so I spend a lot of time working with leaders and working with teams and helping have and facilitate conversations around what's really going on in an organization and helping them to think in new ways. And so inevitably, actually, what happens is that work does bring in what you might actually call sometimes some teaching elements as well. Because what you're actually trying to do is bring new perspectives in. So it can be case studies, it can be different models, it can be experiences you've had elsewhere, it can be different ways of thinking. And you start to do that as part of the conversations you're having with with leaders, with their senior teams. Often what then happens is they say, do you think you could talk to other people in our organization about this as well? And can we actually start getting a conversation going around some of this stuff in the wider organization? So, for example, one thing that I've talked about for years, is I've done some work with organizational psychologists going back about 30, 40 years, some of the research that this is built on. And we've looked at the 9 attributes of all high-performing cultures, right? Almost regardless of what kind of environment you're in, you can talk about the 9 attributes of high-performing cultures. Well, people start to go, well, hang on, can we not foster a conversation around that across the wider business? So before you know it, you've gone from speaking to one CEO, to a leadership team, to a wider cohort in a business. And it's a hop, skip and a jump then to kind of actually take that out as a keynote, take that out as a workshop into other environments as well. So genuinely, I didn't set off with any sort of desire to become a speaker. I'm actually effectively a massive introvert who has to be an extrovert for a living. But it's just ended up kind of evolving that way,
And is that to define the sorts of events you get booked to speak at? Do they tend to sort of emerge out of those conversations with existing companies, or in industries where you've had that traction?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time, the best speaking that I get involved with is actually when people want me to come in and speak to a leadership team or a group of leaders. I have spoken not only to groups of leaders on a given board, for example, or in a given senior leadership team, but I've also spoken to leaders in like membership associations, for example, where they're clustered together around a specific point of interest. And the kind of work I like to do is pretty hands-on. So if you're getting me in to speak, I will not just want to stand there and do a sort of hour-long chalk and talk about the kind of stuff that I like to talk about, but we're actually going to try and do some work in the room together as well, because where this stuff becomes valuable is not as an abstract kind of lecture on the human being in business, but actually helping you think through what are you experiencing in your organization right now that you could benefit from a different perspective around, and then how can we take some of this stuff that I'm talking about, some of this stuff that I've worked with for years, and actually think practically together in the moment about what could be different. So that work is possible when you've got reasonably small groups of people together, or you've got maybe a slightly larger group of people together around but clustered around an interest area where you can then structure a little bit about what you're talking about in that context. So that's a lot of the kind of speaking I end up doing.
And what is it that you love most about speaking?
Especially as someone who has to force themselves to be an extrovert.
Do you know what? Weirdly, I'm actually fine when I get up there. Like so what I actually love about speaking is the topic. Like I'm genuinely I work all the hours God sends anyway, and it's that old cliche, it never feels like work to me. It does feel like work to me sometimes. It's really bloody hard sometimes, but I am just so endlessly interested in all of it. If you start diving into, for example, psychodynamic theory and start to understand the relationship between what Freud and Jung were talking about and how we all show up in contemporary business, there's a whole conversation to be had there, for example. And you could spend literally like 10 years of study just on that. And there's about 1,000 of those, So, and then when you start to actually have conversations with people about their lived experiences in business as well, and you start to understand the kind of, how do you put it, both the sort of the joy of it, but also some of the challenges and the difficulties and the way that we all get in our own ways, right? It's endlessly kind of interesting to me. And it's a way of kind of working on myself as well as working on the clients. In the end, you learn a lot from doing this kind of work about yourself, your own makeup, your own worldview and everything else. So what I love about speaking is the opportunity to get up on stage and talk and explore with people some of this kind of stuff. And at its best, and this is true of the consulting work and the coaching work as well, at its best, it can just sort of feel like you're flying when I think it really is kind of going off. So the challenge for me is usually the before and after. I have to kind of leave afterwards and go for kind of like an iPhone power down, and no one can talk to me for about 3 hours. But actually when I'm there, I feel like I'm flying. It's fine,
I actually bought myself, I can't remember if I mentioned this on the podcast before, but I actually bought myself a Nintendo Switch because I was often traveling, fairly soon after speaking gigs. And I found that I was so incapable of doing anything useful for about 2 or 3 hours afterwards that actually just something that was a completely different part of my brain but kept me engaged was really valuable. So I used to travel, and I don't do it quite so much anymore. I've got various other brainless things I do, but just carrying around something that engaged my brain when it was in that power down bit that you were talking about.
I also just want to say something else. I mean, the other thing is, the other thing that's great thing about speaking is it's not a one-way thing; it's a two-way thing. You're actually in dialogue with people, and you can be in active dialogue with them from the stage. You can be in active dialogue with them during an event. You can certainly be in active dialogue with them after an event. And therefore, it's a bit like when you do the sort of consulting work or the coaching work or anything else. There's this sense of conversation going on. And I remember when I set my business up years ago, the very first blog article I wrote, I stole the title from a Van Morrison lyric, and it was "No guru, no method, no teacher." And because basically I don't particularly like gurus. I don't think you should trust anybody who thinks of themselves as a guru in any way, shape or form. It's like, you're not a guru, you're just a very naughty boy, And so for me, I don't profess to have all of the answers, right? But what I think I can help do in some way is to engage in a sort of spirit of intelligent inquiry, and to try and encourage others to do the same. And so the gift of that, in a way, for me personally, and the thing I love about it, is the fact that you learn from people. You learn from talking to them, and sometimes in some quite comedic ways. I mean, I remember years ago we were doing a kind of workshop with a client. I won't name names to protect the guilty. And we're talking to her about, some of the stuff about high-performing cultures that I mentioned earlier on. And this is a highly paid individual, 6-figure salary, extremely competent in lots of ways. And she was sort of reflecting, and people just say all sorts of wonderful stuff when they're just kind of reflecting. And she went, "The thing is, it's just really alien to us, this thinking stuff." And you're like, that is a gift, right? That is a gift because what she's named there is the actual problem the organisation's got, the kind of cultural problem the organisation's got. She's named it in a way which actually is kind of free from self-blame. She's curious about why that is, and you can then kind of work with that in the room. And also, she's kind of given a form of language to something that we know is a problem in all sorts of businesses all over the world, which is that the overt bias towards action means people don't spend enough time doing, So it's like, and therefore you can kind of take stuff like that and put it in your backpack and kind of go, right, well, that happens at every speaking engagement or everything you do, you're kind of always learning,
What about the other end of the spectrum? What about bad speaking experiences? Have you had any sort of unpleasant or difficult or just problematic experiences as a speaker?
I would say one of the challenges you face is, or I face certainly, is I think I have two things that sort of either work with me or against me depending on the environment. The first is quite a sort of bleak northern sense of humour, which can sometimes present as a little bit more cutting than perhaps I intend it to. And the other thing is, look, you've got to understand the nature of the work as well that I'm interested in. I was talking with someone about this yesterday, actually. It's like you're trying to consistently help people expand their understanding, right? And you're trying to expand your own understanding. And so inevitably, I think there is a danger in all of that you could push people a little bit too hard, or you could push subjects a little bit too hard, be a little bit too confrontational, for example. Like I think that can happen sometimes. And so there's part of me there's the old sort of stand-up comedy phrase, isn't there? If the audience are behind you, you're facing the wrong way. So there's a degree which is like, I'm actually really happy to kind of be sitting there having some degree of tension in the room and some degree of kind of challenge with the audience. But I think you can end up in a situation where where you push it a little bit too far. And once or twice, you sort of look around the room and you're just seeing a load of folded arms, and thinking, might need to wind this back a bit.
This guy looks like he needs to be performing at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival.
Looks, yeah. So both, I would say both of those things, right? I would just say it's like how do you calibrate, especially when you're doing work which is very specific to a given organization, you may be doing speaking or workshops, then how do you calibrate to where that organization is? Because you want to push things, but not push things sort of so hard that they break. Because you don't get me in as a speaker if you just want, an hour or two of light, frothy chat. It's just not the work that you would, there'd be other people who do that a lot better than I would do it,
So what tips would you give to other speakers, Phil? Because it sounds like you've got quite a, I don't know, almost like it feels like a sensible and controlled way of going into kind of the speaking experience that you've told us about. But what would you impart to other speakers that you think would be kind of, useful?
I mean, I would say, when you work with lots of CEOs and boards and leadership teams, as I do, one of the great gifts of being able to do that work is you realize, and I mean this with the greatest of compassion and respect, actually, everybody's kind of making it up as they go along. So I think the idea of being intimidated by a room of people is, in a sense, it's kind of completely misplaced because what you're actually seeing is a whole load of game faces, how people show up at work because it's what they need to do or what they think they need to do to survive. So for me, the first thing is kind of like, look, if you can, I would always try and look beyond that and try and think about the human beings that are actually sat there, not what you think is kind of coming at you from a signaling point of view. And the second and related thing is this, which I learned this from my ad agency days when I was pitching a lot, actually. It can be very tempting when you're pitching anything, and that can include pitching a keynote, to try and judge how it's going over by the expressions on people's faces. But what I learned, and I've learned this for years having sat around the other side of the table watching a lot of these things as well, is when people have got a lot of information coming at them, they're in absorption mode a lot of the time. And I think it's really hard for all of us to be in absorption mode and also be concentrating on what's going on with our face at the same time. So actually, what happens, I think, a lot of the time is that what can look like blank or disinterested or even perhaps hostile is people just in processing mode. So I think all you can do is kind of focus on putting across what you're there to put across with the greatest of kind of soulfulness and presence and everything else, and not try and second guess how it's going over. Those are the sort of two related things. And just final sort of funny comment. I remember there was I'm a big fan of the comedian Stuart Lee, and he said in one of his books, somebody had come up to him afterwards and said, I didn't really enjoy that very much. And he said, well, thank you for the feedback, but I'm not quite sure what you want me to do about it now. And I think there is some truth in that as well. The work is the work, and it's you're not going to please everybody with it.
And what about tips for event organisers? If they're trying to get the best out of you, what do you want them to do?
I think the most important thing an event organizer can do is actually try and communicate the reality of where an organization is at for someone like me. So a lot of the time what you're getting is the brief, right? I need somebody to come in and speak about X or speak about Y or speak about Z. And that's kind of fair enough because they've got a job to do and they've been given a sort of, slots to fill and an agenda to satisfy and all the rest of it. But actually to be able to take a step back from that and kind of go, why? What's going on behind this? Where is the organization? What's really driving the need for us to be having the conversation in the room can really help people like me work out what is going to be of greatest service to those people. I think it's the questions behind the brief, as it were, or the needs that inform the brief that can be so much more interesting and helpful sometimes than just what's written down on a piece of paper and what an event organizer is talking to you about at first glance. So that would be my thought for them.
Very good.
That's brilliant. And that's a great place to wrap up the episode today. So thank you, Phil. Thank you so much for coming on. And thank you too for listening and watching. We hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, please leave a review, like and subscribe. And most importantly, share this podcast with your colleagues and peers, whether they're fellow speakers or event organisers. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.